Welcome, everyone. I have the privilege of being joined today by Henry Brown, who's Director of Learning at Debevoise Plimpton, law firm headquartered in New York. And Henry, I wonder if I can start just by asking you a little bit about you, because my understanding is you are a lawyer that ran away to join the learning and development team. Is it something like that for you?
Yes, it is. I shy away from the term "run away." I was a trial lawyer, an IP litigator. I very much enjoyed what I was doing. I switched my emphasis because my older son was about to enter high school, and I needed to spend, from my perspective, I wanted to spend more time with him. And being a lawyer in a big firm is not particularly conducive to spending a lot of time with your kids. So I switched over to teaching in 2000, actually, which is something I loved anyway, but it allowed me that more time.
And you're a professor, right?
Yes. So I was a law professor for about 16 years. I taught at University of San Francisco and Berkeley School of Law. I taught evidence, constitutional law, and trial advocacy courses. I did that for about 16 years. And then I moved over to the law firm environment because I got to a point where I felt I needed to be more involved with people when they entered the profession. So I started this type of work about 6 years ago, started at another firm and actually switched over to Debevoise right about a month before everything kind of changed.
Thank you, Henry. If I can talk to you about that, please, because I know that we met because we share an interest, an enthusiasm, a passion for diversity, equity, and inclusion. But when the world turned upside down last March with the pandemic, what was it like for you? What happened to the work? What was your world like, Henry, and how did you begin to navigate your way out of that?
For myself, it changed quite dramatically because I had spent a long time thinking about moving back to New York, because technically I'm from New York originally, but left in 1980. So I had spent a lot of time thinking about it, was very excited about it, had very strong views about what my life would be like in New York, made it to New York, and then everything closed. So personally, there was a dramatic change. And professionally, it actually worked out as well as could be expected. The nature of what I do is I'm not just administering the learning at the firm, I'm delivering. And so the nature of what I do is I'm in conference rooms and training people on a regular basis, multiple times a week. We had to it took some time to figure out how we deliver things in a virtual world. But the firm was extraordinarily receptive to various ways we can do that. And ultimately it became quite easy as far as getting acclimated. And in some ways, I got to meet more people because I got to reach more people through the process than I would have reached otherwise with just live programming, because we offer programming to always to our New York, Washington, D.C., and UK, London office, but also to other foreign offices as well. And those are offices that I probably would not have personally reached, but for having to do it virtually.
And then, of course, as if things weren't challenging enough, George Floyd, May 25th, that happened. What did that mean for you, Henry, and for your work?
That obviously caused a dramatic change. As a firm, as with every other business in the world, we had to figure out ways to respond to our people and how they responded both to the event itself and the subsequent protest. It expanded the importance of diversity type of training, things that we were doing before, but there was a greater urgency. And so we did a number of programs in which we had speakers come in, and we had an in-conversation series where we had speakers who were known in that particular space who would touch upon different topics, and we would do an interview with the person in Q&A. But on the training front, it required us to expedite, if you will, some of the programming that we needed to do. And Steps is a great example. We had already decided months ago, and you and I spoke back in February, I believe, about Steps coming in and doing some programming with the firm, the program wasn't always intended to touch upon unconscious bias. That created a greater urgency in getting it done, because there was a period of time around that May timeframe where we were still debating what we were going to do with Steps, because our conception of it was going to be a live presentation, and we had already planned it, and we were set to start it, I believe, in the June timeframe. And then May happens, as well as COVID. And so we had to adjust, well, how do we do Steps? Because really our conception was a live program, and will it work with a virtual programming? You know, we had a number of discussions, you and I, your team and my team, about how to do that. But it made it where we couldn't really put it off indefinitely, because we needed to address those issues. So it expedited, in some ways, the need to do it, but then having to take the time to figure out how to do it right.
Mm-hmm. And Henry, can I just take you back to sort of, and I'd plainly love to talk to you about the work we've done together, but as you thought about May 25th, everything that's happened subsequently, what really worked for you, Henry? What has anything really moved the dial on that? Are you hopeful? Have you done stuff you're really proud of? What would you, if you did stuff again, what would you do differently?
We as a firm, we did a number of events that we are quite proud of, and we thought were very impactful. I paused because the notion of moving the needle is quite a difficult question, because the events of that day really exposed wounds that already existed in society. And so people had a very strong visceral reaction, and it affected them greatly. One of the things we did was we had a consultant come in and have a small group discussions with people from the firm about how they responded to the events, how they acquire their information about public events, because we know that in the United States, the news is quite segmented, and the story that people get is very different depending on where they choose to get their news from. And it was in a very non-judgmental way to just kind of open up the question about, you know, where do you get your news from, and how does that affect how you respond to this? And then finally, the discussion included a section in which, you know, who would the individuals want to continue to dialogue with? You know, other people in the firm, family members, other close friends. And it really was designed to give people a forum to kind of express how they were feeling, as well as to have them start thinking about how they process the events. And the thing that was particularly effective about it was that there was no kind of bias or tilt in a particular direction. It was more let's talk about it. You know, here are some things to think about. Choose to do with that as you may, but there's not like you have to do this or this is the way to do it. Does that move the needle? I think it does. I think it does quite well. But fundamentally, the nature of the exposure was such that as society, we still have not come to grips with that. The January 6th event shows that, because of the nature of who chose to enter the Capitol, what was the motivation, and quite honestly, there was a very racial divide in that, because the followers of the former president tend to be disproportionately, to a very great extent, white, and so the January 6th events kind of almost opened the wound again, because when you compare what happened in the summer in response to the protesters then to the response to the protesters on January 6th, which turned quite violent in the U.S. Capitol, there seemed to be extraordinary, distinction, and that opened up wounds for folks. So as a culture in our firm, I think we've done a great job in having these dialogues as a society. I think everyone, including people in our firm, are still quite raw on these issues, because of the issues continue to come up on a daily basis in this country.
Thank you, Henry. And I just so focusing very much on the States and looking more broadly at the other places that you're in Europe. Arguably, we are living in some of the most divided times in our lifetime. We've got Brexit in Europe that's divided families, communities. In the States, everything before and up to and after May 25th, and now the events of the election. There are lots of people with some deeply held beliefs, lots of strong opinions around. Realistically, Henry, to what extent do people like you and me in our roles, just how influential can we be? What is realistic in your view?
Um, Before I answer that question, I actually want to speak to your kind of build up to that question, and specifically the Brexit and the world events, because that dialogue series that I mentioned, it did include people from our UK and our US offices. And I happened to be in Europe on the day of the Brexit vote, and I followed that whole saga quite closely since the beginning. And there was a kind of comparison made with our UK folks about that very issue, about Brexit, about how both Brexit and the George Floyd killing raised issues that the UK does not ordinarily deal with. And it was an interesting way that as a global firm, the reality is that these changes are not just in the United States, not just in the UK. After George Floyd's killing, there were protests throughout the world, and they were quite extensive. And in some ways, it does help bring people together because of the shared experience in that way. Now, as to what people in our space can do to help the process, one of the reasons why we were looking at steps in the first place is because we wanted to deal with the concept of unconscious bias and finding ways to both have people become more aware in a very impactful way, as well as to have people consider what are some of the fixes. And that's really ultimately what we could do to help move the needle, because all of these issues are issues that people are aware of, but they are issues that continue to persist. And so people clearly have difficulty in finding ways out of it. And one of the things that we always have to do is think about what is a different way for people to see this. And maybe that will help people kind of move that needle. And I think that is the case. I think that's true. But the need to find different ways, because we can't keep having the same conversations over and over again, because I've been in the legal industry for over 3 decades. And when I started in the 80s, it was not very diverse. And I remember very distinctly being interviewed by an entity in the San Francisco bar where I was a practitioner about what did it feel like being one of the few African Americans in a large law firm. And my response at the time was that I had gone to schools that were predominantly not that diverse. And in fact, my undergraduate institution, Auburn University, was ruled, while I was a student, the most segregated school in Alabama. And at the time I thought was, well, if you're the most segregated school in Alabama, that's pretty much the most, period. And so I told the interviewer that was not that unique to me because of those experiences. And I'm finding that the same dialogue has been happening for 3 decades. And so we keep having the dialogue. The needle gets moved very slightly. What I see in law firms today is that at the beginning time, the classes coming into firms are much more diverse than they were 30 years ago. But what we're seeing also is that by the time you get to partnership, that's not the case. And the movement in that range has not been as dramatic as it's been in the beginning range. And so if we're having the same debate and we recognize that things need to be done, but then you don't see as you go down the line, great trade-off, great movement, then the question becomes, is there a different way that we can help people understand how to move the needle? So for us, one of the ways that we have identified is the issue of mentorship, because it's not enough to just bring people in, but it's more important to have people feel that the firm is invested in them. And going back to the concept of unconscious bias, at this point, I don't encounter people who are willingly biased. I don't encounter people who say to themselves, I don't want to have more Black or Latino or Asian lawyers in the firm. That never happens. And in fact, everyone is very passionate about increasing the numbers. What we see is that there's subtle ways that we're not aware of that people don't feel connected to us. And training such as Steps has people see, well, you are acting innocently, you're acting in a way that seems to be the right way to act, but here are the subtle ways that some of the behaviors make people feel as if they're not connected. And having people see that in a dramatic fashion is a way to have them say, oh, okay, I get it now. And you start seeing some changes. And that's where I think we are today.
Thank you, Henry. And so just final question, if I may, just to pursue a thought you've already shared. So Steps is playing a role in helping you with the kind of the culture, the holding up the mirror to the behaviors, the unconscious bias. For you, the next meaningful steps you've mentioned is mentorship. For people kind of listening in your shoes who are wondering and worrying about the same stuff as you do, what other thoughts are there that you might be willing to share that are about the most appropriate, most meaningful next steps in this weird world we find ourselves in?
Yeah, so on that front, let me back up slightly and explain a bit about how we envisioned Steps in the program we did last year and how it kind of segues. And the reason why I mentioned that is because Steps was explicitly used as culmination. For us, we had essentially a year-long mid-level associate training program. And during that program, we touched upon feedback. We had sessions on feedback. We had sessions on communication. We had sessions on unconscious bias. And really, the sessions on unconscious bias were actually called inclusion, on the theory that if you're more inclusive, you will actually be more inclusive of all your attorneys, not just the diverse attorneys. And our thought about that process was that Steps would be the culmination of bringing it all together. And explicitly for the program we did, it was bringing together the feedback and the unconscious bias together. So that way the lawyers can see in action, yes, we've talked about these concepts. This is what it looks like. And so after that, the next step would be to introduce the concepts to more senior attorneys, because we started with the mid-levels. And really, if we want to see movement, we have to do it at the senior associate, which we did do the Steps program for the senior associate, but also the partner level, because the reality is that the people who are making the decisions and who fall into the traps of the unconscious bias are the leaders of the firm. And so for them to see that the dynamic and to be more mindful of that, that's the next step for us, to provide that training at the partner level. But in addition to the Steps training, we do continue to do a number of programs on the concept of unconscious bias, on the concept of mentoring, because if you want to move the needle, you have to have the young people feel more included. And the way you have them feel more included is to provide training for people at the senior levels to be more mindful of the ways people feel excluded. So for example, that In Conversation series that I talked about earlier, we started with the staff. And we are now doing that same program with the attorneys. And I participated in many of the sessions, and they were extraordinarily compelling because they're designed not to explicitly focus on race or diversity issues. What they're designed to do is focus on what are the types of things about our communications that separate us. And what we explicitly set it up where we have a good mix of partners, senior associates, and junior associates. As the people are sharing, who they are, what their background is, people are learning, okay, now I understand what the perspective they have. And I'm not as offended by certain things because I have a better understanding, or that I now understand why it is that I'm reading the person in this way. And that, I think that's going to do a tremendous amount to help move the needle, because that knowing your colleagues better on a kind of more personal level will help create connections. And those connections will help improve the diversity of the firm in the long run.
Professor Henry Brown, Director of Learning at Debevoise Plimpton. Thank you very, very much for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. I really appreciate it.